This is something that I'm trying to do where, a couple of times a year we get some of the leading minds, some of the most interesting minds in Singapore and the region to come and share their thoughts and insights on various issues. So I'm absolutely thrilled to kick this series off with the incredibly charming and perhaps one of the most brilliant minds of our time, Professor Kishore Mahbubani. We are expecting a special guest who is a little late, so we're going to get started, and I'll welcome him a little later when he comes. So let me give a brief introduction on Kishore. I don't think he requires much of a introduction, but Kishore is a distinguished Singaporean diplomat, academic, author. He's made a huge impact in the field of international relations, foreign policy, and academia. Kishore's had a 30-year diplomatic career and served key posts in Asia, and then in the US, in Washington, D.C., and New York, including as Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations and then president of the UN Security Council. And among his many contributions to Singapore, he was most recently the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and is currently chair of the NUS School of Medicine's International Council, of which I also serve as a member. Kishore is also a renowned author, and he has 10 published books. His previous book, The Asian 21st Century, amassed over 3.6 million downloads since its release in Jan 22, and I think that number may have gone up.
3.84.
Okay. To be precise. And those of you who've read his latest book, his Memoirs, which we have some copies of over here, will surely agree with me that it's incredibly interesting, incredibly captivating. And for those of you who haven't read it yet, I strongly encourage you to get a copy and do it. Kishore's extensive Rolodex comprise, political leaders, business leaders, journalists, and I've had the privilege of meeting some of them at dinners in his house. And I think his network really gives him a unique and invaluable insight into the world of global geopolitics. And so, without further ado, please welcome my dear friend, Kishore Mahbubani. So, today we'll dive into geopolitics by examining the defining geopolitical contest of our time, the US-China rivalry. We're going to talk a little bit about India's potential to emerge as a global power. We'll uncover, of course, insights from his latest book, his memoirs, and then reflect on what all of this means for our tiny red dot Singapore. So the format's a fireside chat. I'll kick it off with a series of questions, and then I encourage all of you to think about a question that you'd like to ask Kishore, and we'll try and fit as many as we can in the time that we have. And just finally, one housekeeping rule. We have Chatham House rules out here, so please feel free to take pictures, but no recording of the conversation. Kishore, you ready?
I think so.
Okay, so I think just kicking it off, the obvious first question in the world of geopolitics today has to be the recently concluded US presidential elections. And I think the question that I wanted to ask first is, how will the Trump presidency, particularly his cabinet appointments, including Elon Musk, I don't know what we call him. What do we call him? Like first buddy? So how is this going to reshape?
First lady.
No, Musk is the first buddy, I think. How is this going to reshape global geopolitics? And how do you think his second term is going to be different than the first one?
Well, first of all, let me thank you, Shiv, for inviting me here. I'm really looking forward to the discussion with all of you. But since we are the American club, let me begin by saying Happy Thanksgiving. And for me, actually, Thanksgiving is a very special celebration Because when I was dating my wife, and unfortunately Reshma couldn't be here tonight, I met her early in 1983, and I kept trying, no response. And then out of the blue, she invited me to a family's Thanksgiving dinner. And then I said, aha, there may be hope. And that was the first serious signal I got from Anne that she was thinking about having me join her family. So Thanksgiving is a very special day for me. But going back to Trump, and I guess when you deal with Trump, as they say in America, you got to talk turkey, right? There's no doubt that Trump will be a very consequential president, you know. And, you know, the amazing thing is that if you look at recent history, not long ago we had a brilliant American president called Barack Obama. I think he genuinely inspired the world. He did many good things, but he made one big mistake. He invited Donald Trump to his White House press correspondence dinner. And as Raja Kamal Wuzir showed a video at our meeting in Morocco a few weeks ago, he showed a video of Obama humiliating Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is one of these typical macho American males. He won't take humiliation. It's payback time. And it's amazing how you now have a remarkable situation where you would have thought that in our century, Barack Obama would be a more consequential president than Donald Trump, because Barack is brilliant, has read everything, speaks eloquently, right? He comes here, he'll charm the pants of everybody. Donald Trump is a thug, yes, a narcissist. You can question his ethical values. But you know what? Donald Trump has moved the needle of history, and Barack Obama didn't. And this is the amazing thing about the era we live in. And even someone as a liberal like Janan Ganesh wrote in the Financial Times, clearly already Donald Trump has been a consequential American president because he has moved the center of political gravity of America so much to the right that there's no oxygen left for the left at all. So this is amazing. And what's really remarkable is that Donald Trump is by no means a great thinker. No means at all. He doesn't think beyond his next deal or his next event. And so he's not a long-range thinker in the way that Barack Obama was, by the way. Obama was genuinely a great thinker. Which is why, and I begin with a story of comparing Donald Trump with Barack Obama. Because I was recently in New York, maybe less than 10 days ago, don't ask me exactly which day. And in one morning in New York, I had 5 amazing conversations, you know. Breakfast with the editor of Foreign Policy, meeting with the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, the chairman of a major fund in New York, my publisher, and then the former editor of Foreign Affairs in one morning in New York. And I tried to distill what I learned from them about Donald Trump. And the big message is, don't underestimate Donald Trump. He may do crazy things, but he's not mad. He knows how to take care of himself, and he knows how to enhance his legacy. So one of the most surprising things I learned in New York is that apparently if you ask Donald Trump in private what is his biggest dream while he's president of the United States, his biggest dream is to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Oh, no. So you can tell Barack Obama, you see, I got it too. See? Now you understand. So he's not going to be crazy. He's going to be careful about what he works on.
And how do you think this second presidency will perhaps be a little different than the first presidency?
Well, there's one respect in which the second presidency will definitely be different from the first presidency. For a start, Donald Trump, number one, didn't expect to win in 2016. He never had a team in place. And secondly, after he won, he struggled to get people to work for him. It was a big struggle, and he was a bit cautious. He said, okay, let me find respectable people. And, Jim Mattis, this head of Exxon, Tillerson, and so on and so forth, right? And so he was constrained in many ways by the people he picked. And one of the areas in which he was severely constrained was in fiscal expenditures. Because they all kept saying to him, Mr. President, you can't spend. The debt is going to go up, Be careful, be careful. So he resented it, but he accepted the advice. And Donald Trump was mad as hell that after he stepped down and was defeated by someone he didn't respect, Joe Biden spent trillions of dollars effortlessly. IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS Act. And Donald Trump was fuming. He said, why couldn't I have done that? I could have done that too. I could have spent all these trillions. But everyone said, don't spend. This time round, Donald Trump is going to spend. So be ready.
Be ready for
Biden has spent, I guarantee you, he will up Biden.
So be ready for inflation, guys, I guess. Kishore, I wanted to just move a little bit from the US to what I mentioned earlier, which is the biggest geopolitical conflict or rivalry of our times. And get some of your thoughts. I know you were in China recently, you were in the US recently. What is really happening over there? I mean, what are some of the misconceptions that you believe the Americans and the Chinese have about each other? And in your view, what's the single most important step to prevent this rivalry from, turning into conflict in the coming decade?
Well, I think when you talk about misperceptions of China, there's a huge built-in contradiction in American perceptions of China. Because right now, the conventional wisdom in the United States is that these Chinese, they have lost their way, their economy cannot grow, they're struggling to make 5%, consumer sentiment is bad, business sentiment is bad.
Which is true.
Yeah, exactly. FDI is going down, so China's not going to make it, right? So if China is not going to make it, then fine. Ignore it. It's not a threat. But I can tell you that when the serious policy makers, the professional policy makers, CIA, DIA, Pentagon, and others meet, they know in private that China is going to make it. Which is why the pressure on China will continue to increase. Because the Americans understand very well that in geopolitics, the difference between number one and number two is enormous. And the United States has been number one for at least 130 years. So for both sides, for US and China, this is an existential struggle. Existential. Because if the United States shifts from being number one to number two, it will lose a tremendous amount of privileges. Enormous. So they will, trust me, do whatever they can to remain number one. And in the case of China, it's even more existential. Because the Chinese remember the century of humiliation from 1842 to 1949. So for them, this whole effort by the United States to stop the rise of China is a continuation of the century of humiliation. And the Chinese, they have lots of divisions, lots of disagreements, lots of different views. But one thing they all agree on is never again. No more century of humiliation. No matter how hard they press us, we will succeed. So on both sides, there's an acute awareness that this is existential, which is why I want to stay alive for 10 more years, because the next 10 years are going to be such fun.
But Kishore, just to push you a little bit more on that, in China, it's a very complicated paradox. When you look at what's happening on the ground, when you look at sort of this state control over entrepreneurship, we see that with the number of families that are moving to Singapore from China, and it's been happening for years now. It's not a COVID issue anymore. You look at the real estate sector, you look at high-profile entrepreneurs like Jack Ma being, a professor at the University of Tokyo. And the paradox for me is when I visit China, when I'm in Shenzhen, and I see some of the factories and the manufacturing units and the way that the technology is, it's like you're almost in space time. It's so far advanced. So how do you reconcile this, where on the ground things look very, very bad, and it's been 4 or 5 years now. It's not just a COVID year. But on the other hand, technology, manufacturing, renewables, you look at these areas and they look like the leader of the world.
Yeah, I want to begin by saying that China is a very difficult country to understand. Because it's the largest country, maybe now second largest after India in terms of population. And the complexity of China must be understood. It's because there are 1.4 billion people. It's a very complex story. It's not black and white. And I was mentioning I was in New York one morning, and I had these amazing conversations. But 4 days earlier, I actually was in Beijing, having dinner with a group of venture capitalists and it's very, very successful entrepreneurs in China. And this group of entrepreneurs would easily acknowledge that in the short term, situation looks bad for China, for sure. As you said, business sentiment, consumer sentiment, real estate, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, as you know, the Chinese never think in terms of the next 3 months, quarterly report, or the next 1 year, or the next 4 years, presidential election. Minimum time frame is 10 years. And in the case of China, you always got to ask yourself a very simple question. At the start of any decade, where will China be at the end of the decade? We'll have ups and downs, but where will it be at the end of the decade? And so far, since Deng Xiaoping launched his 4 modernizations, at the end of every decade, China's GNP has gone up significantly. And this is not an easy record, okay? And this record is a result of very careful Chinese planning for the future. So if you look at all the advanced economies of the world and ask yourself a very simple question: which advanced economy in the world has invested the most in the industries of the future? Which one has invested in electric vehicles? Which one has invested in battery technology? Which one has invested in solar panels? Which one in wind turbines? And most stunning of all, in robots. Right? You know, in our world today, 1 in 6 human beings is Chinese. 1 in 3 robots in the world is Chinese. 1 of every 2 robots being born every day is Chinese. So the investment in the future that the Chinese are doing, and you don't even have to put you don't have to add whatever you want on STEM engineering graduates and so on and so forth. Amazing story. So whatever you do, if you're looking for an economy that is seriously preparing itself for the future, you cannot beat what China has done, which is why even the economists, and when I had the editor of The Economist for dinner in my house, Zenny Minton Bedos, I told her, Zenny, many of my friends are cancelling their subscription to The Economist because it's so anti-China, it's so unbalanced. I told her that. And then, amazingly, even The Economist came up with a cover story saying, China, the next scientific superpower.
I hope that's not the contra side, but I will say from all the visits I've made out there, if you haven't, for any of you in manufacturing or investing or looking at any of these sectors, if you get a chance to spend a few days there looking at some of these facilities, it's truly mind-boggling. You haven't seen this anywhere in the world. Okay, I wanted to shift gears a little bit to talk a little bit about India. In an article you wrote in Jan 14th, 2023, you mentioned, and I quote, "The days of a unipolar world order are over, and we're on the cusp of a genuinely multilateral one. India is entering its best geopolitical sweet spot since its independence 75 years ago." And this question is very, very timely at the moment because can you please put your hands together to welcome our dear friend, the Honorable High Commissioner of India, Mr. Shiv Puri. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to repeat this question because I think it's perfect timing. So the question is, in an article that Kishore wrote last year, he says that the days of a unipolar world order are over, and we're on the cusp of a genuinely multilateral one. India is entering its best geopolitical sweet spot since its independence over 75 years ago. It's the opportunity for India to position itself as the world's only truly independent superpower. That's a big statement. What has created this geopolitical sweet spot, Kishore, and how do you envision the coming decade for India?
When you began asking the question, I was so happy that the Indian High Commissioner wasn't in the room. But now I'm very impressed by the intelligence of the Indian government. They knew precisely when the Indian question be asked, and the Indian High Commissioner arrived just before that. That's superior. It's one of the best intelligence services in the world. So anyway, whatever I say about India is what I write about India too. So there's no question that when we look ahead in 2050, there'll be three great powers in the world: United States, China, India. In fact, it'd be a genuine CIA world, you know? China, India, America. uh, and but India is still in nominal market terms number 5 in the world, I believe. By 2030, it'll be number 3, and then it will rise. There's still a certain gap between India and China and the US, but the gap will be filled over the next 10 to 20 years. So no question that India's role in the world will grow significantly. And actually, I do believe I think you used the word geopolitical opportunity from my remarks, right? There's a massive geopolitical opportunity for India because given the contest between United States and China, neither of them can appeal to all the communities in the world, right? For sure. I mean, China can have no real influence in Europe because Europeans are completely tied to the US, right? But if there's one power that is strong enough and independent enough to play a kind of a, independent bridging role, would be India. And I think a lot of countries will be happy if India steps up and does more in the world. So, for example, I can tell you this, that when Prime Minister Narendra Modi invited the African Union to become a permanent member, not a guest, not a visiting member, because guests come and go, but to make the African Union a permanent member of the G20, that was a big shift, and the Africans appreciated it. So there is an opportunity for India, but the problem for India, of course, is that the first priority of any prime minister has to be domestic. And I'm sure Prime Minister Narendra Modi's first priority is to develop his economy, to keep the growth going, to make sure that he keeps on winning the elections. And as you know, Prime Minister Modi didn't get the result that he wanted from the last elections. In some ways, it may have been good for him because it's good for him that it's okay, I've got to be more careful as I go forward. But the results of the election showed that he's got to pay more attention domestically. So on the one hand, this will be the tension for any Indian leader. On the one hand, the global demand for Indian diplomacy, Indian leadership is going to grow. But at the same time, the domestic demand for the Indian Prime Minister's time is also going to grow. And that's the challenge any Indian Prime Minister will have, how to balance the international demand with the domestic demands.
That's interesting, Kishore. And I think just one observation. Last month, we saw China and India reach a border agreement. And I think it seemed to have caught the world by surprise. I don't foresee a lot of people anticipating something like this would happen. But I'd like to ask you, it got very little coverage also, by the way, after it happened, the agreement, the border agreement. And I think recently you said, and I quote, a potential normalization of bilateral relations between these two nations could have far reaching consequences for Asia and the world, including US policy towards the region. So I have two questions. One, what do you think caused this positive shift in China India relations in terms of this agreement? And second, and let's also be honest, both countries remain deeply skeptical of each other. And on top of that, India has a foreign deficit, or a trade deficit rather, with China, which is over $100 billion. And I'm sure that cannot be a very pleasant or happy situation for New Delhi. So do you think this agreement is just a temporary tactical maneuver by both sides, or could it serve as the foundation of a more enduring relationship? Because, the way you described it, there are people who ally with the US, there are people who ally with China. India is sort of in the middle, being quoted by a lot of different countries, and has managed phenomenal relations with all of these countries. And if these two countries can have something where it benefits both people, that could be a potential game changer. So do you see it that way, or do you see this as something temporary?
Well, I think your question was why have China and India come together? I can give the shortest answer, which is I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, obviously I have no access to the internal deliberations of the Chinese government or the internal deliberations of the Indian government. So I can make at the best an educated guess. So with apologies to the High Commissioner, I'll make an educated guess.
I'll just say when he says educated guess, that means he's spoken to a lot of people and got a view.
At the end of the day, it serves the interests. You know, at the end of the day, the one lesson I learned after 33 years of diplomacy, at the end of the day, it's not about friends and enemies. I think Lord Palmerston says that a country has no permanent friends, no permanent enemies. It only has permanent interests. And if there is a convergence of interests, then countries come together, even if they hate each other, right? Let me just give you a side story, right? I just read an interesting article today by an Indian professor called Rajan Menon in the US. It's in his chart book, saying why have Israel and Hezbollah come together to sign the peace agreement? They hate each other, absolutely hate each other. Why? Convergence of interests. See? It's all about interests. So in the same way, it serves the interests certainly of China to have a normalization of relations with India, because India is a heavyweight country in the world. What it does matters a lot. To be in a situation of hostility with India diminishes China's options, makes it difficult to get things done. So any kind of normalization is a plus for China, right? And in the case of India also, it's very important also to normalize with China, because it also creates options for India in case some things go wrong with the United States. Because there's the danger of things going wrong with the United States is always there. Even if you're a friend of the United States, by the way, I mean, just ask the leaders of Canada and Mexico about the tariffs that Trump is going to put on Canada. I mean, you cannot possibly be nicer than Canada and Mexico to the US, right? I mean, Canada and Mexico are geopolitical gifts to the US. They have problem-free borders. They don't have to worry about an invasion from Canada or Mexico. And what does Donald Trump does? He slaps both the countries, right? So that's an example of, even if you're nice to a country like the United States, you can have problems. And certainly, if you ask me about the psychological factors that came into play here, I suspect when the archives are open 30 years from now, some historians will record that India was genuinely surprised at how the Canadian Prime Minister and the Canadian government went full blast against India. Full blast. There are ways or means of handling problems, okay? Either you do it in a low-key diplomatic fashion, make sure, okay, I have a problem with you. I give you an example. We had a problem with a Romanian diplomat who killed somebody in Singapore. We were very firm, very persistent. We got the Romanians to apologize, but not publicly. We didn't make a big fuss publicly, but we persisted. But the Canadian government decided to make this a full blast public issue, right? Which I thought was unwise. And if there was one government that had influence on Canada, a lot of influence by the United States, did nothing. So I'm sure you're India, you're thinking, hey, how much can I rely on the United States? And this is of course another point which is completely separate, nothing to do with this, India, China. But you can see what's happened to Adani, right? And we all know that Adani is very close to Prime Minister Modi. I'm sure the Americans know that too, right? So all these signals mean that it is better for India to hedge its bets by making sure that you have a full range of options. And the way you create a full range of options is by normalizing your relations with as many countries as possible, and then you have choices to make. Whereas if you're locked into an adversarial relationship, you don't have a choice. So that's why it makes logical sense. But again, this is a guess, okay? I have no inside information.
On that note, I want to just shift a little bit to Singapore. You know, we're in this tiny little red dot here. We've got two superpowers, one superpower, one hopefully a potential superpower in the region, and then of course the US. How does Singapore navigate the next decade so it remains as relevant as it is today?
With great difficulty. I think the Prime Minister of Singapore should have waited 10 years before taking his job, because he's taken on his job at a most difficult point in Singapore's history. Because Singapore has made it very clear he wants to be good friends with United States, and he wants to be good friends with China. And you saw just 1 or 2 days ago the photograph of SM Lee Hsien Loong and Xi Jinping on page 1. That's a very strong, powerful signal, you know. And by the way, no American politician wants to be seen on page 1 of his paper with Xi Jinping, right? But we're saying no. We will have photographs of Xi Jinping. So we are not going to take sides, but it's going to be very, very difficult. But at the same time, the good thing that Singapore has done is that it's launched a preemptive strike. And it was SM Lee Hsien Loong who wrote a Foreign Affairs article, who gave a talk to Shangri-La Dialogue, saying Singapore will not choose. We'll be friends with both. I think that will be the consistent policy of Singapore. But if we have to do this alone, it'll be very difficult. Fortunately, we are surrounded by ASEAN. And most of ASEAN is saying, we're not going to take sides. We'll be friends with the United States, friends with China. So that will, I think, will be the buffer that will protect us.
So I want to just move away a little bit from geopolitics and come to a few questions. And by the way, please keep thinking of some questions. We're going to open up to the audience after another 3 or 4 questions. And I'd like to have a conversation on the main topic of this evening, which is Kishore's Memoirs, Living the Asian Century. And I think after this event, Kishore is going to sign a few copies. So if you're around, I strongly encourage you to get one. Before we go into this book, for those of you who haven't read it, I thought I'd just read a couple of quotes that people have written for this book. I'll start with Eddie Teo, who's the chairman of the Council of Presidential Advisors, and he says, I quote, "His seductive writing skills and his excellent storytelling ability make this one of the best memoirs I've read for a Singapore public servant." Martin Wolf, who we all know from the Financial Times, calls this book, and I quote, "far more than the fascinating autobiography of a man who's arguably Asia's most influential thinker on today's transforming global order." And Giorgio, of course, an amazing intellectual, a wonderful person, and the former foreign minister of Singapore, says, and I quote, "Apart from Lee Kuan Yew, no other Singaporean has achieved a wider reach through his writing and speeches." That's pretty strong validation, Kishore. And one of the questions that I have when I read this book is actually more personal. You had a very challenging start in life, and you described that in this book in the first half of it. And one that I think many people would really struggle to overcome. So could you share some childhood experiences or pivotal moments thereafter that helped you rise above these hardships and achieve the success that you have? And during moments of self-doubt or fear, what kept you moving forward?
Well, thank you very much for reading out those generous compliments. Um, it's and if you read the book, you'll see that the first chapter is called Born Poor. Second chapter is called Still Poor. So I've experienced real poverty, I guess, being put on special feeding programs when you go to school, because you're technically undernourished, and growing up in a house without a flush toilet, all these things that you take for granted. So in some ways, clearly, grew up on the wrong side of the street. But in some ways, I consider it a blessing, because if you have to struggle a lot when you're young, it gives you a lot of resilience in the rest of your life. And to me, more importantly, I had a mother who had probably 6 to 8 years of education, and she grew up in Sindh, which is now, of course, part of Pakistan. And for her, it was a real shock to marry a husband who was an alcoholic, a gambler, a smoker. Well, she should have broken down with all those pressures. My father kept losing his job. My father went to jail. She should have broken down. Amazingly, she never broke down. And that, to me, I think was in some ways the greatest source of strength in my life, because I've always said to myself, my God, my mother went through hell and she never broke down. How can I break down? So I think that I would say is the biggest gift that my mother gave me as a child.
That's wonderful, Kishore. You also mention in the book the importance of self-confidence in, I quote, Asia's leaders and citizens. Perhaps you can elaborate on that, but more importantly, have you ever faced moments of self-doubt in your career? Any particular experiences or instances, and how did you overcome it to continue to be a strong advocate for Asia on the global stage?
Well, my memoirs, they've been read by my fellow Singaporeans, and they said that what makes my memoir so different from other Singapore memoirs is that I speak very openly about my insecurities, and I speak about various points in my career where I thought that my career had ended, and I thought there's no more hope for the future. But then I somehow or other survived and continued. And I described, for example, when I finished my second term as ambassador of the UN Security Council, everyone thought I was doing very well. And if you were in New York in 2002, there was a short list of people who would succeed Kofi Annan as UN Secretary General. And everyone would say to me, Kishore, are you running? Are you running? And, you clearly have a good chance. So everyone saw me outside as being very successful. What they didn't understand was that I went through two years of excruciating back pain that was a result of tremendous insecurity. And so there was this paradox in my life, external acclamation, internal insecurity. So the way I managed the two was to follow my mother's advice, who always said to me, Kishore, Kamal, she called me Kamal, not Kishore. No matter what happens, no matter how badly off you are, never tell anybody. Just put butter on your lips and smile and say, all is well.
We can all learn from that. I wanted to also move the conversation in your book to Singapore. We're all well aware of Lee Kuan Yew's pivotal role in shaping Singapore. And by the way, speaking of LKY, I remember being at Kishore's house once for one of his brainstorming dinners that he has, which are very, very exciting. And as soon as I was about to sit down on the dining table, he tells me, that's the seat that LKY sat in, but no pressure. Um, so fortunately, he also serves very good wine, so that eased the pressure very easy, quickly. But Kishore, in your book, you mention two other key figures, S. Rajaratnam and Go Keng Sui, whom you work with, you knew very well, and have been very instrumental in making Singapore what it is today. How important were their contributions, and why don't we hear as much about them as we do about Lee Kuan Yew?
Yeah, actually, I would say that's one of the greatest tragedies of Singapore, because many young Singaporeans don't know that the success of Singapore was not due to one man, Lee Kuan Yew. No way. No way. Lee Kuan Yew alone couldn't have done it. For a start, he wasn't a good economist, right? He was Dr. Goh Keng Swee, who was a brilliant economist, absolutely brilliant, off the charts economist. And then you had Rajaratnam, who was a brilliant foreign minister. So it was basically, by the way, there's just three. Yeah? There were others, Lim Kim San, Hon Sui Sen, Toh Chin Chai, Eddie Barker, all of whom I got to know, by the way, personally. And it was a very much a team effort. And if Lee Kuan Yew hadn't had Goh Keng Swee, hadn't had Rajaratnam, Singapore would not have been as successful as it has been. In fact, one of the primary reasons why I wrote my memoirs, because I want Singaporeans to be aware that there were others who contributed to the success of Singapore too. And recently, when the Public Service Commission interviewed some returning scholars from overseas, and just as they were chatting with them, and they said, "Oh no, by the way, what do you think of Goh Keng Swee?" And the scholars was very puzzled. They said, "Who's Dr. Goh Keng Swee?" It's a true story. These are scholars, young scholars, who haven't heard of the guy who's responsible for the economic miracle of Singapore. No, which is why I spend a lot of time talking about Goh Keng Swee and Rajaratnam.
Now, I think it's very interesting in the book to also get a sense of the historical context that's happened in Singapore. It's hard to get a true feel of it by just reading what's out there, and I think this book does a great job in that. In your book, Kishore, you also write, you say, and I quote, power speaks more eloquently than personality in generating influence. And I'm talking between countries. Yet you also emphasize the importance of personal touch and authenticity, which seem more rooted in personalities. So, how do you reconcile these ideas?
Well, I would say that's the eternal tension of diplomacy. Because in theory, international relations, and by the way, in practice too, power matters more than anything else. I always say my 2 years in the UN Security Council, and you serve for 2 years in the UN Security Council is like joining the World Cup of diplomacy. I mean, that's where all the real games are being played. And I always thought that, when the Security Council meets and decides what should we do about Rwanda, what should we do about Sudan, whatever it is, we must look at the, considerations of real geopolitics, and what are the principles. So I thought there'd be balance between power and principles. After 2 years, I said, forget principles, they're irrelevant. It's all about power. But at the same time, when ambassadors meet and talk to each other, personal relationships matter so much. And certainly, if you look at, for example, at US and China, there was, when Richard Nixon went to China, he was the guy who was technically the most right-wing guy in the United States. He should have hated communist China, and he should have just done his work in an instrumental fashion and then move on. But amazingly, he developed a relationship, Mao Zedong, with Zhou Enlai, And even Henry Kissinger developed a very close relationship with Zhou Enlai. I can tell you in one of my last conversations with Henry Kissinger um, in October 2022, 1 year before he died, we were discussing Zhou Enlai because I think Zhou Enlai is one of the greatest leaders that China has produced. And he said to me, Kishore, one of the saddest things in my life is the fact that I feel that I was responsible for the humiliation of Zhou Enlai. Because what happened was that Kissinger and Zhou Enlai became so close personally. Kissinger said, we need a hotline and in case things go wrong. So why don't I have one phone on my desk, one phone in your desk, and we will be able to talk to each other immediately. And then Zhou Enlai, being a good number two, went to Mao Zedong and said, Kissinger has proposed this, I think it's a good idea, shouldn't we go ahead? He didn't realize that he had just upset Mao dramatically. Mao said, if there's any phone, it's on my desk, not your desk. And the last year of his life, when Zhou Enlai was dying of cancer, he was a political pariah. And a man who had served his country so well died a miserable death. And Kissinger felt personally guilty about it. So you can see, therefore, while it's all about power, personal relationships also matter.
Thank you, Kishore. I want to open this up for some questions. Please start, Sandeep, and then Push and whoever else. So,
Can I get a glass of champagne? Thank you.
So, Shiv, thank you for organizing this.
sure.
Yeah, there we go. Thanks for organizing this. Kishore, thanks for making it such an interesting evening. And the evening has only started. You're famous for saying externally, we've had enough conversations about the plutocracy versus the meritocracy. And if you go back over the last 5-7 years, there have been times when, for one side or the other, it didn't quite resonate. Of course, where we are now, plutocracy as a description of what's happening in the US resonates a lot. Meritocracy as a reflection of what's happening in China, given the purges, given, frankly, the mismanagement of COVID, it doesn't resonate that much for China as it did before. Regardless, give us some perspectives as of today.
Thank you, Sandeep. I'm glad you said that the plutocracy resonates because a week from today, I'll be in Oxford University participating in a Oxford Union debate where I have to debate the proposition that America is a failing democracy, and so which means that it's about how America has become a plutocracy. Now, in the case of China and meritocracy, I can tell you that even people who are chosen meritocratically make mistakes, and China has made lots of mistakes. But on COVID, by the way, in the year 2020 and 2021, if you had gone to China, it was the only country where you could walk around without a mask, and it's the only country that kept its economic growth going. But 2022, they screwed up very badly. And there's a technical explanation for this because they developed defenses against the original virus, but because the virus spread so much and muted so much, they didn't have a defense against the transformed virus, and so they screwed up very badly. So they went from zero COVID policy to zero policy, which is a disaster. So they made a big mistakes. And they continue to make mistakes. But at the same time, if you go to any country in the world and you want to sit down with the governor of a province or the mayor of a city and you want to negotiate with them what you want to get done in investing in the city or doing things done, you cannot find people who are better equipped, better trained than in the case of China. So the quality of mind of the people that you deal with, and I've actually gone to speak at the highest level of the party school in Beijing to a group of governors, and others in China. The way they select their people is incredibly rigorous. It's a bit like how Harvard University selects its professors and so on and so forth. So I would say don't write off the meritocracy story. And I told you I was in Beijing having dinner with a group of Chinese. The drive, the ambition, the determination of these people, don't underestimate it.
Bush?
Thank you, Kishore. It's lovely to hear you, and thank you for being so candid. So I run a startup here, and I'm manufacturing in China with aspirations to go to the US. Given President Trump is coming to power, do you see the world being more divided? And I have two parts of this question. And the second question is that, do you think it may lead or trigger some sort of a world war of some sorts? If not nuclear, but economic perhaps?
Well, I think I'm not, by the way, overall, I'm not totally pessimistic about US-China relations. In the first part of his presidency, Trump will increase the pressure on China. So, but at the same time, as I said earlier, he was not going to be crazy. So, for example, if he announces a 65% tariff on Chinese products, which he says he would do, I can tell you what's going to happen the next day. The markets will crash. And as soon as the markets crash and people are unhappy, Donald Trump will change course. Because several people in New York told me this when I was there. He doesn't bother about the economic growth. He's concerned about how the markets are doing. And he doesn't want to be a president where the stock markets crash. So if the markets react adversely against measures against China's imports, then he will change course. So I think he will be, at the end of the day, after trying to apply as much pressure as he can on China, he will make some kind of deal. And in fact, at the discussion in Beijing with these very well-informed Chinese people, they told me that in 2019, US and China came very close to a deal. And what happened was that the Chinese negotiator, Liu He, gave a lot to the United States. And then the Politburo, as you know, this is publicly reported, reacted against Liu He, and China walked away from the deal. And Donald Trump was mad as hell. How can you walk away from a deal? We agreed to this. But what I was told in Beijing is that if you take the same deal of 2019, which the Chinese had rejected, put it on the table, if Donald Trump proposes it, maybe China will say yes. So it's possible.
But Bush, I would say, especially since you're sitting next to the High Commissioner, move your manufacturing to India. Nilesh.
Okay, I'll just have a follow-up question on the same topic, just slightly different perspective. I mean, what is your take on this, that in a way, it is the great withdrawal from the international stage by the US under Donald Trump? I mean, I don't see, except for maybe Argentina and one or two here or there, where bilateral relationships between US and that country could be improving with the new government. with the libertarian views of variety of people in the government, with Trump trying to really pass the cost of reduction of twin deficits on other countries and so on and so forth. It looks like, I mean, the withdrawal from NATO, withdrawal from COP, withdrawal from variety of these things. I mean, what does it do to the rest of the world? I mean, do you agree with that US is withdrawing and that's going to be a material new historic force, not just for next 1 or 2 years, but for a long time? And second is, how does that realign the world?
Well, I think there will be some degree of withdrawal from the rest of the world. So I can tell you, for example, Donald Trump has said some very nasty things about Africa. He's used words I cannot repeat about what he said about Africa. But there is also a lot of institutional continuity in American policies. He wants to try and dismantle the state, but he cannot. There are lots of there's long-term fundamental interests that have been built up. For example, in the Gulf region, they have thickened their relationship with the Gulf cooperation states. They cannot withdraw. They cannot. So there are many parts of the world where the relationships are deeply entrenched. But at the same time, Trump is also quite transactional. And where he thinks the cost is too high, he will leave. And I'm surprised the subject of Ukraine hasn't come up so far. Because the saddest man in the world on the night that Donald Trump was elected was Zelensky. And just to drive the point home, Donald Trump's son sent out a tweet. Donald Trump Jr., Zelensky, your allowance is cut from today. So there certainly some people will suffer as a consequence of some degree of American retraction. But there cannot be a massive American retraction. There are too many. There are 800 American military bases around the world. You can't shut them down. Every base is some kind of commitment. So there won't be a massive American withdrawal at all. No.
Questions?
I have a question. So my name is Priya. I run an American company here in the region, India, Southeast Asia. One of the things that we've been struggling with is the war for talent, especially in the context of Singapore. And here, if you look at, there's a story which says, great managers create good times, but good times create bad managers, and then bad managers create bad times. And bad times actually create great managers. So in your story as well, in your personal story, when you spoke about the tough times you had growing up, that really resonated, because that is usually the playbook for becoming a strong individual, a resilient individual. In the context of Singapore, we are arguably in the point of great times, which unfortunately is leading to relatively less resilient youth, relatively less, even like that hunger for growth, that hunger for driving is not there. What's your take on this from a Singapore government perspective?
I must emphasize, I don't speak for the Singapore government. In fact, the Singapore government will be horrified if they learn that I was trying to speak on behalf of the government. But I think you're absolutely right. Your fundamental point is a correct one, that the Singapore government does worry that all this affluence and comfort has taken away the hunger and determination and ambition of young people. That's a fact. And that's something that the government does worry about. But so far, Singapore is kind of managing it. And Singapore is a very lucky country because it has an escape valve, which is that it can bring in immigrants, right? I mean, look at this amount of talent in this room. Much of this talent in this room comes from outside Singapore, and they've come to Singapore. So Singapore still has the capacity to integrate talent from overseas. So I think that will be the safety valve for Singapore. So you will find enough hungry people, some among the older Singaporeans, some among the newer Singaporeans.
Have you been meeting a lot of 21-year-olds here who talk about work-life balance in the first interview?
Oh, yes. Not just that, not just work-life balance. I think the belief that they can be promoted within the first 2 years of their career to senior manager. It's very real.
All right, I think we have time for one or two questions. Ashley?
Thank you, Mr. Mahmood. A quick one. Whilst everybody's concerned about US, China, and all the strife that is possible, one area which was, very neutral and peaceful, or rather relatively peaceful, was Europe, or rather balanced, and helped maintain balance between some of these powers. There's a relative amount of strife that's happening in Europe, apart from Ukraine. You're getting right-wing governments, literally election by election. Which way do you think Europe is headed? There are questions on the economic prowess, but which way do you think it will be able to position itself politically? Thanks.
Let me be very blunt. Europe has lost its way, sadly. I wish it hadn't. I wish that Europe would still have very strong leaders who would be able to guide Europe to deal with a much more challenging world. But again, I mentioned in my last one-on-one conversation with Henry Kissinger, I still remember vividly some of the things he said to me. And one of the things is, by the way, he's quite indirect, okay? He never says things directly, but you get a message. And the message he was trying to convey to me is that the quality of mind of European leaders has gone down dramatically. And I know this because I accompanied Lee Kuan Yew when he went on his farewell tour of Europe. And we met Margaret Thatcher at number 10 Downing Street. We met François Mitterrand. We met Helmut Kohl. Really heavyweight, long-term strategic thinkers. Today, there are none like that. None. Zero. And it's very strange. What's amazing is that 100 years ago, in 1924, Europe could run the world. In 1924, 100,000 Englishmen could effortlessly rule over 300 million Indians. Amazing. I still don't know how they did it. 100,000 against 300 million? How do you do it? Miracle, right? Today, the Englishmen cannot run themselves. What they need is more Indians. Probably the best prime minister they had was Rishi Sunak. Much better than Boris Johnson or Liz Truss, right? So, the world has changed so much from 1924 to 2024. And this is part of a larger cycle of history. So, in 2050, Europe will be in a miserable place. In 2050, Asian societies will be thriving. And that's an undeniable reality.
And the UN Security Council will still look the same. I think we have time for one.
No, the UK will give up its seat to India. The Financial Times agreed that they should do it.
There might not even be a United Kingdom anymore. One final question. One question here, and then Bikram, and then I think Kishore, you're still around for a few minutes after that. You can say 1 and 2.
My name is Ashish. First of all, thank you, Shiv and Kishore, for this lovely meeting. So my question is, Xi Jinping, he's been very aggressive on his foreign policy, the wolf warrior. He's gone and upset most countries around. So Xi Jinping, he's been very aggressive with his foreign policy. Ever since he's come in, he's upset most of his neighbors, whether it's India, Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia. What has China gained out of it? Because he's pushed India into court much more, taken much more seriously. Everyone's allying against China. So what has he gained? What are his, when he sort of looks back, how would he be viewing it?
Well, I can tell you that Xi Jinping is a very powerful man. But he's not that powerful that he determines everything on his own. It's more China, not just Xi Jinping. And Chinese foreign policy is made in a very complex fashion. It's not driven by, Donald Trump can personally decide to do anything. I think Xi Jinping is going to be much more careful. He's got to still carry the party with him. And if you mention some of the incidents like Philippines, if you ask yourself who's been consistent and who's been inconsistent in the Philippines-China relationship. The first, Philippines had a president called Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, pro-China. Then they switched to a president called Aquino, pro-USA. And then they switched to another president, Duterte, pro-China. And then they switched to Marcos, pro-USA. So, if you have a foreign policy that goes this way, you're asking for trouble. Whereas by contrast, Vietnam, which has got equally serious problems with China, much more serious, maintains a strategic discipline. So what happens in a relationship takes two sides. And Vietnam, Vietnamese have a philosophy that to become a leader of China, you must be able to stand up to China and you must be able to get along with China. If you can't do both, you cannot be a leader of Vietnam. But that's why Vietnamese manage their relationship with China. And even though Vietnam has got far more serious problems with China, Vietnam has agreed to build a fast train from Hanoi to Kunming. That's a really big deal. This is across a border where in 1979, 1 million Chinese soldiers, 1 million Vietnamese soldiers fought each other. Now gone, now there's a fast train. So international relations doesn't depend on personalities. It depends on interests and how you manage them.
Final question, Bikram, and then we'll.
Okay, Shiv and Mr. Mahbubani, thank you so much for the time. One of the things that we've seen a lot of in the last few years is conflict with Ukraine and Russia and with what's happening with Israel and Gaza. Are we in a world which is comfortable with conflict because the world seems to have moved on? And does this give rise to more potential conflicts, for example, China and Taiwan? And in all of this, where does something like the United Nations stand? Does it have any influence in all of this?
Yeah, the big question is whether or not interstate wars are sunrise or sunset industry. And right now we have a blip. We have two major wars going on which are very distressing, the Ukraine war and Gaza war. But there's a scholar in Harvard called Steven Pinker who's written a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature or something, in which he documents that if you take the long arc of human history, the number of people dying from interstate wars is going like this. Over the long term, up and there are blips here and there, we are going through a blip. But I think by and large, most human beings realize that the stupidest thing you could do is to go to war and kill each other. It doesn't make sense. And these are the things that are survival from our tribal past. But I think hopefully as we educate humanity, we escape our tribal past. And so you have a situation where now in Southeast Asia, where we are today, right, which is the most diverse region of planet Earth, there's been no major war for 45 years. So that shows that we are moving in the right direction. So on balance on wars, wars will not end suddenly, but overall, the long-term trend line will be a more peaceful one.
On that optimistic note, we'll end the evening, and Kishore has kindly agreed to sign a few copies of his book. If you don't have a copy, please get one. You'll get autograph from him. And thank you all for coming. Please put your hands together for Kishore Mahbubani.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.